In a time of chaos, when empires clashed and faith was on trial, one man dared to bridge the divide between power and piety. This is the story of St. John I, the 53rd Pope of the Catholic Church, a peacemaker, a diplomat, and a martyr. Let's journey back to the late 5th century, to the sun-kissed hills of Tuscany, where a boy named John was born around the year 480. Early life and background, c. 480–500. Little is known about John's early childhood, but historical consensus places his birth somewhere in Tuscany, in what is now Italy. He was born into a world still reeling from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, just a few years before his birth. Rome was no longer the political titan it had once been, but its spiritual authority, rooted in the papacy, was gaining increasing influence. Young John would have been raised in a deeply religious atmosphere, possibly receiving an early education in the Roman liturgical tradition and the classical Latin texts of church fathers. By the time he was a young man, John had joined the clergy, likely starting as a deacon in Rome. His intelligence, piety, and political savvy were noticed quickly. The state of the church and empire, early 500s. As the 6th century began, the papacy found itself squeezed between two major powers: the Ostrogothic kingdom, which ruled Italy under King Theodoric the Great, an Arian Christian who held Rome in his grip; the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, led by Emperor Justin I, an Orthodox Chalcedonian Christian who ruled from Constantinople. This religious divide, Arianism versus Orthodox Christianity, would become central to John's story. Elected Pope, 523 AD. In the year 523, after the death of Pope Hormisdas, the Roman clergy elected John as the next bishop of Rome, Pope John I. Now in his early 40s, John inherited a fragile church navigating dangerous waters. The papacy had to placate both the Arian Theodoric, who tolerated the Catholic Church but demanded loyalty, and the increasingly powerful Byzantine court, which expected the Pope to uphold Orthodox doctrine. This was not just a spiritual office. The Pope of Rome was now a diplomatic power broker, walking a theological tightrope. The crisis of Arianism and Justin I's decree, 523–525 AD. The flashpoint came swiftly. In the Eastern Empire, Emperor Justin I had issued edicts against Arianism, expelling Arian clergy and closing their churches. While this was in line with Catholic orthodoxy, it infuriated Theodoric, who feared the persecution of his fellow Arians would incite instability, and that the Pope might be siding with Constantinople. To resolve the crisis without risking open conflict, Theodoric chose an unlikely emissary, Pope John I himself. The historic journey to Constantinople, 525 AD. In 525, Pope John became the first pope in history to visit Constantinople. Accompanied by a delegation of Roman senators and clerics, he sailed across the Adriatic to meet Emperor Justin I face to face. It was a monumental moment. A spiritual leader, negotiating between empires, he was received with grandeur. Eastern sources record that John was honored like a prince, even crowned during the Easter celebration, an act symbolizing unity between East and West. His mission was twofold: persuade Justin I to ease the persecution of Arians, avoid alienating Theodoric by appearing too sympathetic to the Orthodox. John succeeded partially. Justin eased up on his edicts without compromising his stance. But while John's diplomacy calmed the Eastern tensions, it had grave consequences back in Italy. Theodoric's wrath and John's arrest, 526 AD. Theodoric was deeply suspicious of the Pope's alliance with the Byzantines. He believed John had overstepped, potentially conspiring with Constantinople to undermine Ostrogothic rule in the west. When John returned to Ravenna, the Ostrogothic capital, he was arrested on Theodoric's orders. The Pope, once a diplomat of peace, became a political prisoner. He was imprisoned in Ravenna, isolated and denied food and medical care. After months of suffering, Pope John I died in captivity on May 18, 526. He would be buried in Rome, in the Basilica of St. Peter, where pilgrims still honor his tomb. Legacy begins. The martyr, Pope. Though John's papacy lasted only 3 years, his impact was profound. He is revered not just as a pope, but as a martyr, a man who died for peace, caught between emperors and doctrine. He was canonized shortly after his death, becoming St. John I, commemorated every May 18th by the Catholic Church. But what happened next? How did his death shake the fragile political alliances of the time? It was the spring of the year 526. After months of imprisonment in the city of Ravenna, Pope John I, once a respected diplomat and spiritual leader, died, weakened by neglect and isolation. But his death was not the end of his story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. This is the final chapter in the life of St. John I, his canonization, his enduring influence on the Church, and how his legacy lives on today. Death and burial, the first seeds of sainthood. Pope John. His body was transferred back to Rome, where he was buried with honor in the Basilica of St. Peter. The Roman faithful mourned his passing, not just as a religious leader, but as a man who had been sacrificed at the altar of imperial politics, almost. Immediately, John was venerated as a martyr. Though he had not died by the sword, his suffering and death under unjust imprisonment fulfilled the Church's ancient understanding of martyrdom by endurance. Theological legacy. Faith. Above politics, St. John I's story marked a significant shift in papal identity. His mission to Constantinople and the ultimate price he paid helped redefine the Pope as not just a bishop, but as a global moral voice who could challenge kings and emperors alike. He's remembered for upholding orthodox Christian doctrine while protecting the rights of others, including Arians, refusing to become a political pawn, even when it meant imprisonment, bridging a temporary unity between East and West during a time of growing schism. In many ways, John I set the precedent for future popes like Gregory the Great, who would fully embrace the dual spiritual and diplomatic role of the Bishop of Rome. Global veneration and patronage. St. John I is not one of the Church's most widely known saints, but his legacy is deeply respected, especially among Catholic historians. The clergy advocates for religious diplomacy. He is often invoked as a patron saint of prisoners, negotiators, and those persecuted for justice. Churches in Italy and across Europe bear his name, including the San Giovanni for Martyr in central Italy. Impact on the papacy. John's death left a scar on the relationship between the papacy and the Ostrogothic kingdom. Just months later, Theodoric the Great also died in late 526, and his successors lacked his political strength. The death of Pope John I helped expose the fragility of the Ostrogothic rule in Italy and increased support for the Byzantine reconquest under Emperor Justinian I a few years later. In retrospect, John's martyrdom paved the way for future popes to act more boldly, spiritually independent, even under foreign rule. Relevance. Today, what we learn from St. John. In today's world of religious and political tension, the legacy of St. John I offers valuable lessons. Courage in diplomacy. John teaches us that peace doesn't come without sacrifice. Unity of belief and action. He stood firm in his convictions, even when threatened by imperial powers. A model of service. He accepted a dangerous mission not for power, but for the greater good. St. John. I reminds us that leadership, especially spiritual leadership, comes with great risk, but also great purpose. His name may not be widely spoken today, but in the quiet corners of ancient basilicas, in the hearts of those who stand for peace under pressure, the legacy of St. John the One continues to burn brightly. His life was short, his influence eternal. Share the Historia Martyr is not made by the sword, but by the strength to endure for truth, inspired by the life of St. John the Few.